I stand before you an American woman with a Korean name and a laywoman, but in robes. How did this happen? Because my grand teacher was Sungsan Sonsanim. I'm going to share with you my personal thoughts on gender and then move into how Kuan-Yin changed gender in China and what we can learn about that and how that demonstrates resilience, and then what we can learn in our modern practice. What makes a woman a woman? Is it her life-bearing capacity of a womb? Many of you here, like myself, have decided not to have children, so that's not as important to us. Is it the crowning glory of her hair? You venerables may laugh at that, it's fine. Is it the fact that women have breasts? And although men have them too, they're not sexualized in the way that women's are. I recall having a discussion like this in a small group setting. I was attending the Rains Retreat at Deer Park Monastery in Escondido, California. That's part of Thich Nhat Hanh's lineage. It was the spring of 2004, and I had been calling myself a Buddhist for about 8 months at that point. The speaker was a breast cancer patient. She had lost her breast to surgery, and her hair and her menstrual cycle to chemotherapy. And she was asking the group, was she still a woman? We had no answers for her. It wasn't that sort of a session anyway. It was simply a time for each person to share what was coming up in their hearts and minds during the hours of silent meditation. Answers were neither required nor expected. I would remember this conversation some 8 years later when I received my own breast cancer diagnosis on my 48th birthday. In my first surgery, one breast was removed. A month later, with the first dose of chemo, my body went into what I can only call thermonuclear menopause. I stopped menstruating that day, mid-cycle, and never had another menstrual period. All my remaining eggs were killed off by the chemo. And even though I had never wanted children, I still briefly mourned that lost potential. About 12 days after my first dose of chemo, my hair started falling out. To add insult to injury, it does not, as the English language poet Dylan Thomas said, go gentle into that good night. When the hair follicles die, they go kicking and screaming, and it was very painful. I had already cut my hair into a shorter style, but I still missed it as it came out. I had thought it was one of my better features, and I mourned my hair as I had mourned the loss of my eggs. And there I was. One breast left, which was also going to have to come off eventually, bald and infertile. Was I still a woman? This time, I had some answers to that. My answer was and is, I am woman, hear me roar. Because I choose it. Because I choose to be a woman, and therefore I am a woman. It has nothing to do with my body or my form, as we say in Buddhism, and it certainly has nothing to do with what is written on my birth certificate. It was simply how I felt, more feminine than masculine, although both are at play in all of us all the time. And both are societal constructs that have nothing to do with biology. When I meet trans persons, I'm happy to treat them as whatever gender, including none, that they present as. If I could choose to be a woman when I had no breasts, no eggs or hair, then so can anyone else. Kuan-Yin's move from male to female in China speaks to the impermanence and emptiness of gender. Buddhism has adapted to whatever culture it's migrated to. In my own country, the United States, Buddhist groups gather to meet on Sunday mornings and Wednesday evenings for no other reason than that's when the Christian groups gather. And that's what people are used to. In Japan, Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines occupy the same religious temple compounds. Tibetan Buddhism has associated many of the shamanic practices of the indigenous religion of Bon. Just as Buddhism as a whole has acculturated itself, so have the Bodhisattvas, the holy men and women on the path. When Avalokiteshvara migrated from India to China, he was renamed Kuan-Yin. Avalokiteshvara is commonly translated as the Lord who looks down with compassion. Kuan-Yin means cry regarder, while the alternative form Kuan-Shi-Yin is regarder of the cries of the world. Perhaps because Avalokiteshvara did not have a solid mythology at the time his cult arrived in China, it was relatively simple for the Chinese to create their own legends around this new being in their midst. Those legends reflect what people needed to hear at that point in time, a feminine construct of compassion. Kuan-Yin was venerated in China as early as the 1st century of the Common Era. And I'm going to start referring to Kuan-Yin as they from now on because they are known as masculine in some countries and feminine in others. They were depicted in art largely as male through the 10th century, although some popular manifestations of Kuan-Yin were feminine as early as the 5th century. Sometime around the 11th century, their iconography began to shift to more feminine representation. And since the 15th century, Kuan-Yin has been seen as almost exclusively female in China. There are several thoughts as to why the Chinese saw Kuan-Yin as female. Perhaps they saw compassion as a more feminine quality than as a masculine one. It could be that they perceived a reference in Kuan-Yin's mantra as being feminine in overtone. Kuan-Yin's feminine transformation could also have been a reaction to the patriarchal governance of institutions of Buddhism and Neo-Confucianism. Had these two religions not lacked feminine icons, the transgendering of Kuan-Yin may not have occurred. It may not have been necessary. Regardless of why the Chinese chose to change Kuan-Yin's gender, or alternatively, why the Bodhisattva themselves decided to change their own gender, the fact is that gender representations of Kuan-Yin are impermanent. Just as our physical forms change over time, so does the iconography of Buddhism, especially that of Kuan-Yin. A Bodhisattva who is unattached to gender and form demonstrates resilience. When speaking of gender, it's important to note the distinction between relative and absolute. On the level of the relative, men and women are different. Men cannot bear children, women can. According to the International Labor Organization, on average, women generally, globally, are paid about 20% less than men. Gender does make a difference, despite what all of my male teachers have told me. On the level of the absolute, my male teachers were correct. There is no gender, just as there's no form at all. There is nothing to be attached to. The reason that I find this distinction important is because of all the male teachers who have told me, and probably you, that gender is irrelevant. My own Zen teacher, who founded a Zen order, said there should be no distinction between monks and nuns and that all genders would be called monks. When I asked him why we could not refer to all of us as nuns, he was genuinely confused. Why is the default the masculine term? I wondered this, and I have never received a satisfactory answer. When Buddhist teachers who are part of a dominant group, be that by gender, race, or class, tell those who are in the minority or lacking power that these things don't matter, then they're referring to the absolute. Western male teachers have been known to say things like, "Enlightened mind is beyond gender, neither male nor female." That answer is fine as far as it goes, but it does not go very far towards equity in the relative world. On the relative level, gender matters. And yet not to Kuan-Yin. They chose to move from the dominant gender to the subjugated one. That's a powerful lesson in resilience. According to the American Psychological Association, resilience is the process and outcome of successfully adapting to difficult or challenging life experiences, especially through mental, emotional, and behavioral flexibility and adjustment to external and internal demands. One of the topics of this conference is resilience, and I believe that Kuan-Yin demonstrates that in their ability to be what is needed in a particular place at a particular time. The Bodhisattva Kuan-Yin chose to adapt themselves to the needs of the world rather than running from the difficulties inherent in belonging to a member of a vulnerable group. They embraced the opportunity. Much like the Tibetan female Buddha Tara, Kuan-Yin made the decision to be female. Having been male, female, and androgynous, Kuan-Yin demonstrates the ability to adjust to external demands. When China needed a female manifestation of compassion, Kuan-Yin was not deterred by the limitations of the female form in the relative realm. They were not put off by difficulties or challenges. Rather, they overcame any potential negative repercussions and thrived in whatever form they chose to manifest. While we can acknowledge the role of gender in the relative world, we can see Kuan-Yin's example to remind us that, ultimately, gender is as empty as any other phenomena. The Buddha advised us not to become attached. We can take that advice while continuing to strive for gender equity. Reminding ourselves that gender is strictly a relative concept may be a good start. Lessons modern Buddhists can learn about gender identity and awakening from Kuan-Yin. In the Lotus Sutra, there are a total of 33 manifestations of Avalokiteshvara, including female ones. The various forms are provided to suit the understanding of different readers. I'm going to quote from Peter Harvey in his excellent book, An Introduction to Buddhism. His manifestation in many worlds are in forms which may include a transformation body Buddha, an arhat, a Hindu god, a monk, nun, layman, or laywoman. Regardless of why the Chinese people decided to regender Kuan-Yin, let's presume that Kuan-Yin themselves was in agreement with this decision. If we can accept Kuan-Yin as an actual being rather than a human-made construct, what can we learn from them? First, that gender is simply another aspect of form, and form is emptiness, at least according to the Mahayana schools. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Gender is emptiness, emptiness is gender. In other words, gender has no independent arising. Rather, it arises from causes and conditions, which are certainly influenced by karma. I have always enjoyed movies where the male lead is a personification of a horribly misogynistic person in his life, and he's forced to come back, already as an adult, because it's a Hollywood movie, as a woman. And I wonder how often this actually occurs to various beings due to the negative karma that they have around women. One of the teachings inherent in Kuan-Yin's gender transformation is that gender is simply not important. To put it another way, if a specific gender is not needed for awakening, although there are teachers alive today who believe that only men can become enlightened, the Buddha told his cousin Ananda that women could awaken just as men could. That reasoning, in fact, is why the Buddha changed his mind and decided that women could ordain as nuns. However, the Buddha noted that the ordained path would be more difficult for women than for men. Some of the reasons for this are biological. First, women are not as physically strong as men. And that's a generalization. There are some women stronger than some men, but this is just in general. The arduous walking that the Buddha embraced could prove difficult for some women. Excuse me. There is the matter of menstruation in ancient times and having to deal with the hygiene. Clearly women could do that, but did the monks want women around in that situation? Kuan-Yin is not attached to their gender. Whether they present as male, female, or androgynous, Kuan-Yin is the one who hears the cries of the world. Excuse me, just a second. I had a cough drop, and clearly that was not enough. Okay, let me find my place. Gender is perhaps the single aspect of form with which most people identify most strongly. As Rita M. Gross writes, many people, both women and men, simply cannot imagine who they might be without their specific gender markers and traits. Gender is marked on our birth certificates, and in most countries it becomes a legally enforceable status. Therefore, if we can relax our grip on that, we can let go of similar attachments to race, eye color, and so on. We can learn that the other aspects of form are equally insignificant. Moving from form, we can begin to release our clinging to the other aggregates, namely feelings, perception, impulses, and consciousness. Suddenly or gradually, all of the things that we believe make us us begin to lose importance, and thus our dissatisfaction with life, our suffering, our dukkha diminishes. And isn't that the point of Buddhism? To reduce our suffering and that of others by releasing our grasping minds. The primary thing that we grasp upon is our sense of self, and within that sense of self, the primary thing most people grasp is gender. Kuan-Yin does not have a personal sense of self. They are the very embodiment of compassion. They are content to appear as we need them to appear, male, female, or somewhere in between. Kuan-Yin has released the small I in favor of the big I, and so can we.